flexible and understanding in this rather challenging time. And a particular shout out to Susan, who has done a terrific job of helping us navigate into this strange online world. Just as a matter of logistics, if you haven't already muted your audio and you're not Nate, please do so now, because it tends to make the acoustics better for everybody. And then just be ready to unmute when it's time to ask a question. I want to use, as we did last week, the raise hand function, which you find under the Participants tab on your Zoom site. Again, when we get to the Q&A, if you want to ask a question, just raise the hand, and then I can call on you according to the list. And then just one final thing I wanted to note for everybody. We have an unusual guest with us today, which is Mrs. Bernard Fall, who I noticed was online. That's, I think, an unusual circumstance for us, but I wanted to extend a welcome to her. Glad that she's here, and I hope she enjoys the discussion and the presentation. Without further ado, the speaker today is Nate Moir, who's one of our Ernest May Fellows here at the Kennedy School. He did his undergraduate work at St. Olaf's College in beautiful Northfield, Minnesota, and then has got a master's and PhD from the State University of New York at Albany. He has been a member of the U.S. Army Reserve. I think that's still the case, Nate, and also worked at the Naval Postgraduate School, has published in a variety of refereed and non-refereed forums. And as someone who learned about Bernard Fall when I was a student thinking about Vietnam, I'm really looking forward to this presentation. So I will keep quiet now and turn everything over to Nate. His slides should be visible on your screen. Nate, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Dr. Walt. Also, thanks to all of you who are dialed in today for my presentation. So here's my agenda. I have 2 introduction slides, which are followed by my argument and information about my project's place in the historiography on this topic. Then we'll transition to what I framed as part 2 of my presentation, where I will discuss Fall's background and its relevance to scholarship on Vietnamese revolutionary warfare. Now, as kind of some background, about 12 years ago, I was a first lieutenant at the U.S. Army Special Warfare Center and School at Fort Bragg, attending and completing the Psychological Operations Qualification course. It was far less arduous than the Special Forces Qualification course, for example, but I was personally familiar with what Special Forces had to do to become qualified as such. Not long after completing my course, I was reading Bernard Fall's 1961 book, Street Without Joy, and came across this quote, which stopped me in my tracks. What hit me was the social environment to which Fall referred that spontaneously created revolutionaries. It was a really stark difference from the time, effort, and expense that I knew went into an individual's month-long attempts to complete and graduate the Special Forces Qualification course, let alone all the follow-on training they completed. The disparity Fall pointed out drew me into his work, and I was interested to learn more of the social forces, as he wrote, that spontaneously created revolutionaries. As to the wars in Vietnam, in Vietnamese studies, and among foreign relation historians who focus on the subject, the wars are typically divided into the periodizations that you can see under Fall's quote. Time does not allow me to provide an overview of all these conflicts here today, of course, but I do cover them in my manuscript to the extent that they help readers unfamiliar with the wars to understand Fall's scholarship of them. Now, to fast forward to 1965 for a moment, I would like to provide this summation regarding how Fall perceived the United States option to choose military action after March 1965. Fall had this to say in a letter to the editor in Newsweek in October of that year. I'll just give you a moment to take a look at that. Now, Fall's point about Guantanamo at the time really stood out to me when I came across this letter to the editor, but I thought that he really kind of emphasized the type of mindset that Fall had with regard to his place in the scholarship on the war. Now I'd like to move to my argument. Let me just move these little screens over here so I can see my whole thing here. Okay, so Bernard Fall is an underassessed scholar and critic of the Vietnam War. He created the first analysis of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the first diagnostic assessment of Vietnamese revolutionary warfare. As a product of interdependent social, political, and military factors unique to Indochina, Fall demonstrated how Vietnamese revolutionary warfare could not be defeated through military force. My project assesses the evolution of Fall's thought on revolutionary warfare and how military force could not achieve the United States' political goals in Southeast Asia. And so for me, I argue that Fall's diagnostic analyses of the Vietnam War emerged out of his experience as a member of the French resistance and as an analyst at the Nuremberg tribunals. I argue that he would not have reached the conclusions he did without these experiences of violence in the Maquis, for example, and knowledge of institutionalized atrocity during World War II and at Nuremberg. Additionally, I argue that Fall was among the first scholars to recognize how the United States' failure to understand and address revolutionary warfare narrowed its strategic vision and subsequent policy making related to intervention in Vietnam. And these failures led to an over-reliance on militarized approaches to containment of Vietnamese revolutionary warfare after full intervention in Vietnam in 1965. Now, there's a couple definitions that I need to make sure that I'm clear about, that I want to just take a moment or two to go through these next couple slides. And this is a definition of revolutionary warfare. And Fall really used a qualitative approach to this as opposed to quantitative approaches. And the top quote is really, I think, the most succinct definition that he provided. And I'll read it. Revolutionary warfare is the result of the application of guerrilla methods to the furtherance of an ideology or political system. Political action is the difference. The political, administrative, and ideological aspect is the primary aspect. The military aspect definitely always remains the secondary aspect. And so the second quote there also, I think, reveals some of the qualitative nature that he meant with that first quote that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. He answered his question, why is it that we must use top-notch elite forces, the cream of the crop of American, British, French, or Australian commando and special warfare schools, armed with the very best that advanced technology can provide to defeat the Viet Minh, Algerians, or Malay Chinese terrorists, almost none of whom can lay claim to similar expert training and only in the rarest of cases to equality and firepower? The answer is very simple. It takes all the technical proficiency our system can provide to make up for the woeful lack of popular support and political savvy of most of the regimes that the West has thus far sought to prop up. The Americans who are now fighting in South Vietnam have come to appreciate this fact out of firsthand experience. And I would go so far as to say that the Americans fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, as Patrick's demonstration last week showed us, also probably recognize this as well. And then the bottom quote there is really, I think, probably the most succinct definition that Fall got at with regard to his ideas. He wrote, when a country is being subverted, it is not being outfought, it is being out-administered. So to provide a broader context as to how Fall perceived the United States action in Vietnam as early as 1965, the following quote is revealing. You can see there on the left is a letter from Bernard Fall to John Paul Vann that I got from the Library of Congress while doing research there. The statement I quote here provides a good indication of Fall's thought on the overall lack of wisdom concerning intervention that emphasized over-militarized action. In order to keep moving, I'd like to bring up another key definition that is critical to highlight today. Now, parallel hierarchies is an idea that Fall got from a number of other French officers, particularly in 1957 and 1958, and he saw it really taking primarily two forms. You can see there the first one is the utilization of existing structures through infiltration of subversion. The other one was the creation of new clandestine structures designed to take over administrative responsibilities. I spent quite a bit of time in my manuscript discussing Fall's analysis of the Viet Minh security services. You can see them listed there at the top, the Dig Van, the Cong An, and the Trinsat. These were three different organizations that were really fascinating with, for example, creating both a subversive organization, but also with creating new ones as well. And together, these formed what we now would refer to as a network of networks. At the time, this organization called the Lien Viet, there in the middle of the screen you could see, was an organization of subsidiary civic groups that formed these parallel hierarchies. And organizational hierarchy was really key. At the bottom of the screen, you could see basically a hierarchy of different administrative committees that existed between 1945 and 1955. This became far more complex as we entered into the Second Indochina War. And you can see the distribution of these administrative committees there on the right-hand side throughout the whole breadth of the Indochina Peninsula. These also extended into Laos and Cambodia as well. Now, at the very bottom of that hierarchy, you can see the village level. And this is where I really gathered a lot from the analysis of Stathis Calivas. And I sourced his analysis of local level violence, particularly through his book, The Logic of Violence in Civil War. I gained a lot of insight from what Calivas regards as a Clausewitzian approach to civil war. This approach is a triadic structure, he argues, in which two or more armed groups, in this case, the French on one side and the Viet Minh on the other, are in competition with each other in a contest to gain the loyalty, whether through coercion or other means, of civilian populations. Now, concerning parallel hierarchies, the following visual representation, I think, is a helpful tool. I'd like to draw your attention to the two arrows on the left and then to the right. On the left-hand side, this is a graph from 1964, and it was the best copy I could find, so I realize it might not be entirely clear. But on the left, it says preparation of revolutionary cadres and masses for a revolution, going from the top to the bottom. On the right-hand side, it states preparation of parallel hierarchies for taking over government positions. And I think this is a really good illustration to show how Fall's ideas were making its way into the early stages of the United States operations in 1964, 1965. But you can see that all this is underground until it reaches that plateau and then goes above ground. So it's really like a type of iceberg in a lot of ways. And I would also like to mention here this quote on the right-hand side too as well, if I may read this. And this is, I think, a really key quote that Fall had. He wrote, "I believe that the whole problem of the meaning of war in this new context will have to be re-examined sooner or later, taking into account the facts that parallel hierarchies, revolutionary warfare, and active sanctuaries are here to stay, and that our present response of concentrating on the external military symptoms of the problem simply has no bearing on the preponderant political, social, economic components." You know, and if I may, in my professional opinion, I would like to point out that this meaning of war to which Fall refers is something we still need to re-examine today, because we are dealing with the same kinds of problems in places ranging from Iraq to Afghanistan to other conflicts. It's my goal to help encourage a re-examination of the meaning of war along the lines that Fall advocates here. And in order to provide another context regarding what Fall was seeking to express, this quote by John Adams really reflects the political underpinnings that are so critical to revolution, and why they are difficult to contain or possibly even defeat through overly militarized action. You can see John Adams writes in 1818, "The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in the religious sentiments of the duties and obligations. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affection of the people was the real American Revolution." This very well could be something that Ho Chi Minh had written in 1945 or 1946. Now, I'd like to just take a moment to briefly highlight a few texts that were influential to me as I developed my project. Andrew Preston, Daniel Besner, and David Milne are just a couple examples of texts that were models that kind of modeled the approach that I wanted to incorporate in my project that used an intellectual biography or argumentative biographical methodology. Theoretical approaches are not limited to these, but two of these here that really appealed to me was Calivis's work, which I mentioned, as well as David Kilcullen's ideas on the formation of revolutionaries. Calivis, in particular, as I mentioned, stands out because of his descriptions of the phenomenon of what he called microviolence in civil war. This is most powerfully evoked in analysis where actions such as denunciation and collaboration are significant to unleashing violence, and especially how the concepts of intimacy and barbarity are key features explaining why civil wars are perceived as more violent and cruel than conventional wars among combatants. Now, here's a couple other final points that I make about the historiographical aspect of my work. I'd like to highlight that my goal is not to produce a biography of Bernard Fall, but an analytical assessment of his scholarship on Vietnamese revolutionary warfare. Necessarily, I do have to cover many biographical factors in my work, but I focus on the intellectual influences and developments in his thought regarding warfare. You know, there's many other positive assessments of Fall's work as well. In addition to an op-ed by Dr. Frederick Logeval, John McCain, for example, in a New York Times interview from May 2018, commented that, quote, "Fall's two books in the French Indochina War, Street Without Joy and Hell in a Very Small Place, warned us about the mistakes we should have avoided making in Vietnam," end quote. This is a lesson that I hope we will someday eventually learn. So far, we have obviously not done so, as war in Iraq especially indicated. So these are some of the archives on which I relied in completing my research. I was very fortunate to have the proximity to the JFK Library where I've conducted the bulk of my work. It's a large archive, as you can see, 248 linear feet, and it's divided into two main series. And I've really enjoyed becoming deeply familiar with this particular series, and Fall's resources has been a real goldmine to help me understand the overall context and milieu in which he created this resource. Now, at this point, I'd like to move on to part two of my presentation to provide at least a glimpse of Fall's background and how it contributed to his scholarship on Vietnamese revolutionary warfare. So Fall was born in Vienna, Austria in 1926 to a Jewish family consisting of his father, Leo, mother, Anna, and younger sister, Lizette. In 1938, during the Anschluss of Austria, the Fall family emigrated to Nice, France, where they joined a type of kibbutz called the Villa Beauregard. It's interesting to note that the historians I meet who know about Bernard Fall are often surprised to hear that he was an Austrian who was later naturalized as a French citizen because of his service during World War II. I argue that Fall's Austrian background and his Jewish faith are critical to the formation of his thought because he was deeply aware of social difference and his status as an outsider in ways that emigres, especially in times of war, are often tragically familiar, is very pronounced. This outsider status mattered because in late 1942, the French council overseeing the residence in Nice, where the Falls resided, denounced foreign-born Jews, including the Falls, and Vichy authorities raided the residence where the Falls were located. Leo escaped because he thought they were arresting only men, but Fall's mother, Anna, was detained, sent to Drancy, and then to Auschwitz, where she perished. Fall's sister, Lisette, found refuge in a nearby convent, and Fall, who was ill at the time, was not present because he was convalescing in a family friend's residence. Not long after this, Fall's father joined the French resistance, was captured and murdered by the Gestapo the following year in November 1943. After this event, Fall joined what he referred to as the real Maquis in the French Alps in Haute-Savoie, southwest of Geneva, Switzerland. After his time in the Maquis, he joined the Free French Forces and then the regular French army during liberation. I'd like to point out there at the bottom bullet, you can see that Fall was assigned to the 4th Moroccan Mountain Division on this, and this was an important development because it introduced him to North African soldiers who were not always especially enthusiastic about contributing to France's dominance of their countries. Now, the Maquis were often responsible for targeting French collaborators, and I'd like to take a minute to highlight Fall's perspective on why targeting collaborators had such a consequential political effect in controlling local populations. On the issue of collaboration, according to Fall, he wrote, quote, "The legitimate targeting of collaborators was the kind of deterrent effect we were actually looking for, the kind that would isolate the German troops from the population, in fact, insulate them. There would be a complete loss of contact with the population without creating any adverse reaction towards us," end quote. Now, Fall's emphasis on an action of insulation between civilians and German troops in this social context is critical to his thought on political violence. Collaborators' elimination separated Germans from civilians and consequently separated German soldiers from local information they needed to form coherent local intelligence. This identification of effective separation, insulation as Fall regarded it, contributed to his thought on warfare, and he later referred to this form of social insulation as part of a process of competitive control in both the war between the Viet Minh and the French, as well as in the Vietnam War. Now, moving on, and after the war, the Nuremberg trials are best regarded as consisting of two main tribunals. The first, at which the main Nazi leadership was tried, was called the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, and it tried individuals such as Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, and others. During it, Fall worked primarily in the language division as a translator. At the second series of trials, referred to as the Nuremberg Military Tribunals, Fall's primary focus was investigating the German arms manufacturer, the Krupp Corporation, and its use of slave labor in the production of armaments for the Nazi regime. During this second series of Nuremberg trials, Fall's official work title was
Stop molesting me.
Research Analyst on the staff of the Office of the Chief of Counsel for War Crimes. Now, Fall had serious work to accomplish because the Krupp Corporation maintained 138 work camps and used slave labor, primarily women, who, as Germany advanced further into Ukraine and Russia, were sent back to Germany to work for different Krupp munition facilities and other armament production sites, rolling sheet metal, making bricks, and other tasks. You can see Fall there by the map. He's the young man to the right of the map. And then on the right-hand side, you can see Fall on the back of that table, whereas Telford Taylor, who was a brigadier general, was the chief prosecutor during the Nuremberg military tribunals during the second set of trials. Now, an atrocious corollary to this was the number of young children and infants that these women laborers also had because they were mothers in a lot of cases. Fall documented numerous cases where children and infants were kept while their mothers worked. The cases of neglect were really difficult to read in Fall's staff evidence analysis, and historian William Manchester also recounted Alfred Krupp's role in directing the massive amount of slave labor conducted by women. Now, as a parting remark for this slide, Alfred Krupp and most of the Krupp Corporation's leadership were convicted of war crimes, and Krupp received a 12-year sentence he served in Landsberg prison. Originally, Krupp was supposed to be tried in the first tribunal, along with Goering and others, but a bureaucratic confusion moved his case to the second tribunal, where he was given a far more lenient sentence than what was expected. Krupp, as it turned out, was nonetheless a convicted war criminal and a devoted Nazi sympathizer and supporter. Now, after Fall's work at Nuremberg, he came to the United States as a Fulbright scholar in one of the first classes of young individuals to be selected for this program. The picture there is him when he was working in the ROTC program at Syracuse University. And while attending Syracuse for a master's degree, Fall took a summer course at SACE at Johns Hopkins, where his professor Amory van den Bosch suggested that he focus on the First Indochina War. This became a turning point in Fall's life because the next year, in 1953, Fall traveled to Vietnam to study the war between the Viet Minh and the French while it was still in progress. Now, before moving on to that event, it's important to note that while Fall was ill in the United States, the High Commissioner for Germany, John J. McCloy, decided to commute Alfred Krupp's sentence because of his belief that Krupp was needed to help restart the German armaments industry to confront the growing Soviet threat in Europe. This is a development I cover in my writing at length, but I can only touch on here. But as you can imagine, this was a real blow to Fall and perhaps undermined some of the idealism he held for the United States, especially after everything he had been through during World War II and at Nuremberg. Now, in early 1953, Fall travels to Vietnam for 10 months of field research. And the primary result of this research was his first book, which was collected there in that title, The Viet Minh Regime, Government and Administration in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Now, I focus on this year in this publication in particular in my manuscript because it was the first book to describe and analyze the development of the Viet Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Notably, it was also during this year in 1953, war that was still going on between Viet Minh and the French, that Fall gathers the material for what would become one of the best books written on warfare, period, a book called Street Without Joy, which was published in 1961. I'd like to mention that Fall's work is really remarkably unique because of the primary sources he used and had access to. As an example, he was one of the only and earliest scholars to use Vietnam Dan Quoc Con Bao, which you can see listed there at the bottom bullet, which was the DRV's own government newsletter. His use of such primary sources, for example, documents detailing the operations of the Viet Minh and their decrees, sets him apart from almost every other scholar who published analysis on the wars in Vietnam. Now, this picture on the left is Fall working on his dissertation, which was completed in 1955. You can see he's got a typewriter there, so I don't think anybody who's finishing a dissertation now can complain with all the word processing abilities that we have. But he was living in Ithaca, New York at the time, where in addition to completing his dissertation, he also worked for the Cornell University's Southeast Asia program. And I'd like to briefly highlight the graphics on the right of the slide. When Fall first arrived in Vietnam in 1953, a French briefing officer depicted the overall control the French military believed they had, and this is the northern portion of Vietnam. As you can see in the top graphic, the official view presents an overall benign picture of what the Viet Minh controlled. But as Fall conducted his research, traveling to a majority of provinces all over Vietnam, both north and south, he began to put the analytical skills he developed as a research analyst at Nuremberg and as a graduate researcher to work. Instead of relying on military-related indices such as troop levels and secured provinces, Fall began to examine social-focused indices such as tax records and teacher placement. He quickly began to realize that the Viet Minh controlled the majority of the social functions of Vietnamese society, not the French. This is why he called the bottom graphic in this slide the real situation. This is the type of analysis that really hit home for me during my own deployment to Afghanistan in Nangarhar and Kunar as a PSYOP officer, because I saw the United States military relying on a similar military-focused set of indices, social-oriented ones that demonstrated where real control of society existed. And as we have learned, measuring political legitimacy and other factors that are critical to understanding progress in conflict are still currently difficult to measure. Now, I'm going to move briefly through this slide, but want to highlight Fall's interest in the diversity of the South Vietnamese population, which is pronounced in his work. For example, he completed extensive analysis of the Cao Dai and the Hoa Hao religious organizations at a time when many Americans had difficulty locating Vietnam on a map. As you can see, this is an article from Pacific Affairs in September 1955. Now, the Cao Dai was a syncretic religion that integrated the organizational hierarchy of the Catholic Church with Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucianist practices, and their headquarters is located to the northwest of Saigon. There you can see in Tay Ninh province. The Hoa Hao, in contrast, was located in the western Mekong Delta region in the Kamau Peninsula. It was a Buddhist organization which grew significantly in the 1930s under the leadership of a young individual named Hun Pho Sao. The Hoa Hao were violently opposed to communists during this time because the Viet Minh had killed their spiritual leader, Hun Pho Sao, in 1947. Now, the key takeaway about this slide is that these groups had large militias and they opposed the No Din Diem regime and administration, which was established in the summer of 1955. And they, along with the Bin Zuen, were defeated by Diem's forces in what became known as the Battle of Saigon in 1955 as well. Now, in addition to these groups, Fall studied numerous ethnic groups in the Central Highlands and also worked for the Human Relation Area Files, which was then located at American University in Washington, D.C. It's now located at Yale University. I could spend a lot more time discussing his work on this topic, but I just wanted to provide this to give you an idea of his early work and what would become known as area studies. Now, with this slide, I want to point out the status that Fall was quickly consolidating as a new member of what was then the political policy establishment at the time. You may notice Fall as one of the authors in this particular issue of Foreign Affairs. You also may notice there in the middle bullet there that there's a young Henry Kissinger who was a fellow on the Council of Foreign Relations during this academic year that this was published. But before we're moving on, it's worthwhile to point out that Bernard Fall was 29 at the time that this article in this edition came out. And it's certainly a goal that eludes me, but many others who want to make a mark on foreign policy analysis. But he was really establishing himself as a scholar here. I would love to be able to discuss the relationship between the French Communist Party that he discusses in this article and the Viet Minh further, but we have to move on. But if you'd like to know more about this, however, you're welcome to call me tonight or this weekend, because I don't have anywhere else to go. We'll make it a short call. Now moving on to...
None of us are going anywhere.
So in this following slide, I want to mention that Fall returned to Vietnam for his second research trip in 1957 to be able to assess difference. And historians really focus on, how do you measure change from one point to another? Well, going back to Vietnam a second time really enabled him to do this. He secured funding for this trip from the Republic of Vietnam with a set of tasks that included assessing changes in the country since the Republic's founding in 1955. And to achieve his study, Fall focused on economic, but also security developments in particular. During this research trip, he also managed to secure a contract to teach administration, essentially public policy and international relations at the Royal Institute in Phnom Penh. In the graphic located on the slide, this is from an article called South Vietnam's Internal Problems, published in the Pacific Affairs in September 1958. Fall depicted what he perceived as a troubling security environment, and he used many of the social-based approaches to determine his conclusions that he had used during his first trip in 1953. And I wish to point out that the analysis depicted here focused on activities initiated by the organization that would soon become widely known as the National Liberation Front. And the key point here is that Fall was tracking the development of the NLF, the Viet Cong, almost 3 years before they were more widely described as being a fully functioning communist organization intent to undermine the Republic of Vietnam. Methodologically, the primary takeaway is that Fall was focused on administrative-related indicators such as assassinations, tax collecting, and the development of parallel hierarchies. These more than common military indicators such as troop deployments and other factors revealed the implementation of what he now regarded at this time as Vietnamese revolutionary warfare. Now, in May 1958, he published his findings in an article for The Nation entitled, "Will South Vietnam Be Next?" In the article, Fall utilized research from the second trip to Vietnam to assess the United States aid program to Vietnam, particularly its commercial import-export program, which was administered by the U.S. State Department's organization, which was called the International Cooperation Administration, the ICA. The main problem he found was that the program for aid was poorly designed as well as poorly executed for Southeast Asia. A primary reason for this is that the aid program was based on plans that had previously worked very well in Europe through the Marshall Plan, but that they weren't adjusted for the historical and social context, and especially the physical environment found in Vietnam. Specifically, aid was delivered through a mechanism called counterpart funds. In short, counterpart funds are a technique for turning foreign aid into reserves of domestic currency. Economist for Council of Foreign Relations, Ben Style, described counterpart funding as one of the great tools for delivering aid to European countries recovering from World War II through the Marshall Plan. Style is correct in terms of counterpart funding's successful use in Europe, but Fall's criticism was that this system in 1957 was not working, and it was in fact counterproductive for the South Vietnamese economy. It didn't work for several reasons. The first was that there was a lack of agricultural focused materials that were specifically designed for rice cultivation. Secondly, there was a delivery of commodities such as corn and milk that were, according to Fall, not popular among the Vietnamese. there was also a lack of cold storage for these types of commodities. The aid program especially emphasized unneeded consumer goods such as tobacco and alcohol, and industrial plants manufacturing things like mopeds and typewriters, and other items such as hi-fi stereo systems and other goods. Now, as a preview of his Nation article, Fall presented his overall findings in this particular work at the Asian Association Annual Conference in New York City in April 1958, a month before the Nation article was published. Now, this was attended by the South Vietnamese ambassador to the United States, and Fall publicly summarized his overall argument regarding the United States aid program with a very concise quote. And he was very, I love these about Bernard Fall. He really says something powerful in a short amount of time. He wrote, "South Vietnam needs hi-fi stereo systems like it needs a hole in the head." And now, when this got back to John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State at the time and oversaw the International Cooperation Administration, one does not have to imagine what he thought of Fall's analysis. In the following months, Fall's contract to teach was quietly dropped by the State Department. Now, this is the telegram John Foster Dulles issued questioning the wisdom of Fall's potential employment teaching in Phnom Penh. Really, it was a passive-aggressive way of telling his staff to undermine an already signed contract between the International Cooperation Administration and Bernard Fall. Needless to say, he was understandably frustrated when he learned that this opportunity was taken away due to his honest appraisal of facts on the ground, which he had documented in person, and that was originally written to help adjust the U.S. foreign aid program in support of the Republic of Vietnam. As in most cases, time proved that Fall was correct in his assessment. Only 3 years later, the John F. Kennedy administration dismantled the International Cooperation Administration and established a new government entity, USAID, with the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. But unfortunately, these 3 critical years between 1958 and 1961 were lost. And the South Vietnamese economy weakened because of the poor foreign aid program that Fall had analyzed in 1957 and 1958. One can only wonder if an economically stronger Vietnam might have had a better chance to confront the growing unrest that eventually emerged with the formation of the National Liberation Front in 1960 and 1961. Now, this is another quote that was a real find when I was going through Fru's volume about Vietnam. And this letter was written from Wesley Fischel of Michigan State University to No Dinh Diem in April 1960. If you just bear with me, I'd like to read this because this really struck me at the time when I found it. Wesley Fischel wrote, "In this connection, Bernard Fall is preparing a sharply critical article on Vietnam. In New York the other day, he boasted publicly that when he wrote about the deterioration of security in the Nation magazine some 2 years ago, and I had contradicted his interpretations and his facts at the time, that he had been right and I had been wrong. Now he intends to prove that your government, No Dinh Diem's government, is about to fall, that the people oppose you, that corruption is rife, and that your government in Famille is destroying all possibility of democratic growth in Vietnam, that his map of terrorist activity in Vietnam, which he published in Public Affairs in 1958, was correct, and that, furthermore, he has once more secured from confidential French files similar evidence of terrorist activity in Vietnam today, which he now plans to publish. It is a matter of some pain to us, who are your friends, that your enemies are better able to secure detailed information about what is happening in your country than we are." Now, moving on to Act 5, I would like to highlight a number of professional activities to which Fall contributed despite his being blocked from employment by the U.S. State Department. It's interesting to note that Fall became a valuable resource for the Department of Defense, who requested Fall's expertise on numerous occasions. The Commandant of the U.S. Army Special Warfare Center and School, Major General William Yarborough, for example, replied to a State Department official who had complained to him about Fall lecturing at Fort Bragg, quoting, "Until you can find me somebody who knows more about Vietnam, I'm going to continue inviting Bernard Fall to inform our soldiers." Now, a few of the other contributions included his being one of the only Western journalists to interview not only Ho Chi Minh, but also, as you can see in this picture below, Pham Van Dong, who was the vice president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In addition to this issue of Marine Corps Gazette you see here before you, Fall was also a consultant and reviewer for Special Operations Research Office, the Foreign Service Institute, U.S. Special Warfare Center and School. In fact, Street Without Joy was used as a single text for a class on irregular warfare in 1963. He was also the Wahao expert for the U.S. Navy's Chaplains Corps program called the Personal Response Program. He also wrote for the U.S. Information Agency, and in addition, he was a guest lecturer at almost every U.S. service, staff, and war college, as well as provided several appearances to provide testimony before the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Now, with my time getting short, I'd like to first draw your attention to the quote on the right-hand side of the screen that encapsulates Fall's approach to how he believed the United States should pursue its operations in Vietnam. He wrote, what America should want to prove in Vietnam is that the free world is better, not that it can kill people more efficiently. If we could induce 100,000 Viet Cong to surrender to our side because our offer of social reforms are better than those of the other sides, that would be victory. Hence, even a total military or technological defeat of the Viet Cong is going to be a partial defeat of our own purposes, a defeat of ourselves by ourselves, as it were. Now, I have a short little video that I'd like to show you. I just have to adjust my microphone so that you're able to hear it.
I don't think we can hear it.
Nathaniel, we can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yep, sorry, I have to adjust the microphones to play for the video. I just wanted to preview this by saying that Fall was an editor of the collection of Ho Chi Minh's writings. It was published in 1967, and the short 2-minute video will kind of give you a sense of how he explained who Ho Chi Minh was to Walter Cronkite. Just give me 1 second here to adjust the microphone, and I'll play.
You've gone mute again.
Okay, I'm having a little problem with playing this video. I'm going to try to get this going here in just a second. See if I can just back up here. Okay. Stand by, please.
If Ho Chi Minh were a Westerner, he would probably be known as the best public relations conscious Western ruler in the world. He is extremely response conscious. Everything is done with its effect, its ultimate effect on the populace. The uncle idea is his idea. It's Bác Ho in Vietnamese. It's Uncle Ho. Remember these words by an American officer who knew him back in '45. He said, "This awfully sweet old guy." You know, well, you don't go around and call Stalin or even Gomulka or Khadr an awfully sweet guy, or even Tito. These may be at certain times not totally despicable people, but nobody will ever say of Mao Zedong he was an awfully sweet old guy. Whereas of Ho Chi Minh, this is the sort of thing come through. Now, some people say this is a 24-hour-a-day act, and it will point to the fact that when it comes down to the crunch, Ho Chi Minh in the past has at least allowed, if not ordered, the execution of some fairly old associates. But Ho Chi Minh has succeeded in preserving, in keeping a distance from all this. It's always the assumption, if only Ho Chi Minh knew, these things wouldn't take place. And this has really been a fantastic performance in this particular sense. Nothing that ever happens in North Vietnam that's bad reflects on Ho Chi Minh as a person. There's yet, in South Vietnam, for example, anyone who's willing to go on record insulting Ho Chi Minh as a person. I'm sure you're as aware as I am that the South Vietnamese will say a great deal about the North Vietnamese, that they're communist puppets, that they're fighting China's wars, etc., etc. But you will not find anybody who say Ho Chi Minh is a dirty bird. Some of the things that you hear in South Vietnam always is, well, when everything's been said and done, Ho Chi Minh is the George Washington of this country. And we are in the unhappy position of having to find a counter George Washington. And these people are hard to find these days, anywhere.
Okay, can you hear me again? Okay, yeah, thank you for your patience. I had to adjust back and forth between a different microphone setting to play the video. Now, moving on to Act 6, I'm in my last two slides here. In February 1967, Fall was with the 1/9th Marines for a 3-day operation called Operation Chinook II. Marine Corps gunnery sergeant named Byron Highland were killed after setting aloft a large piece of ordnance that the Viet Cong had been placed in a dike. This particular blast also injured several other Marines. Bernard Fall was 40 years old. Now, if you look to the left-hand side, this is a copy of the funeral service that I got from, or that I found in the Fulbright papers at the University of Arkansas. And I'd like to draw your attention to the eulogies there in the middle of the page. And I want to ask, what does a 40-year-old have to accomplish for the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, a university president, a major general of the United States Army, and the French ambassador to the United States to all offer eulogies? And the answer is really a great deal. I'd also like to add that Fall had a family who he left behind. This is obviously a large and important part of his life, and I believe they are online attending this presentation. In fact, I know it. Thank you. Fall's wife, Dorothy, and his daughters, Nicole, Elizabeth, and Patricia, thank you for your interest in my presentation and for attending today. Now, in my research, I continue to find ways through Fall affected a profound influence on subsequent events as the Vietnam War escalated. These quotes provided will give you an idea of this. You can see the top one, which is the only one I'll read here. The Fulbright wrote, Fall has provided a more important part in the Vietnam War than any other writer. He not only wrote history, but also participated in its making. He was a historian and looked to the future as well as to the past. And I would like to save the discussion of Vietnam Reader there, edited by Marcus Raskin for the Institute of Policy Analysis, which he co-edited with Bernard Fall. And that was really instrumental in the anti-war movement and for initiating the teach-ins that began in May 1965. But we'll save that for the Q&A session. Now, in the conclusion of my study, I extend my analysis of Fall's legacy. It is highly relevant to our own time. For example, I show how contemporary conflicts echo multiple points that Fall made about revolutionary warfare. I'd like to highlight the bottom quote there by C.J. Shavers, which is indicative of the same type of thoughts that Fall offered in the 1950s and 1960s. Shavers writes, some of the world's most expensive attack aircraft were being applied to small and seemingly unsolvable tactical problems in remote corners of the earth. Sophisticated targeting sensors, guided munitions, and tactics refined through a dozen years of air-to-ground war cannot change the facts on the ground. Well, this is very similar to the general criticism Fall made about war in Vietnam. Now, in conclusion, it's my goal that my work will help others understand the value of re-examining the relevance of Fall, not only so that they may better understand the Vietnam War, but especially other conflicts ongoing today. With that, I'd like to look forward to your questions.
Okay. That's terrific. Thank you, Nate. That's really fascinating stuff. And I actually, although there was a little bit of technical trouble there, I appreciated the opportunity to hear the interview as well. So the floor, the digital floor is now open. So if you have a question or a comment that you would like to direct to Nathaniel, just find the participants tab, look for the raise hand button, hit that, and I will see it. And John Holland McCowan has got my attention. Don't forget to unmute your microphone. John.
Great, thank you. Nathan, that was a great presentation. I really enjoyed that, learned a ton. You mentioned at the very beginning